Ambassador Frank Miller stood before the rebuilt Galactic Council chamber and looked out at an assembly that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. Representatives from over 200 species sat together in an arrangement that defied every traditional boundary in galactic politics. Former enemies worked as allies, ancient rivals shared resources, and species that had never spoken to each other were now planning joint missions to the galaxy's most dangerous regions. "The war is over," Frank announced to the gathered delegates. "The Purist Alliance has been defeated, their fleets scattered, and their ideology rejected by the vast majority of galactic civilization. But we are not here today to celebrate victory. We are here to build something new." The final battle had taken place in the neutral zone, where 12 species had gathered their combined fleets to make one last attempt at destroying human influence. They had expected to face only human ships, but instead they found themselves confronting an alliance that included more than 50 different species. "The humans are not alone," Vextar Commander Kexvor had announced at the start of the battle. "We stand with them because they have shown us what we can become." The battle itself had been unlike anything in galactic military history. Traditional formation flying had given way to the chaotic, adaptive tactics that humans had taught their allies. Ships from different species coordinated their attacks using improvised signals and intuitive understanding rather than rigid command. Structures. Captain Ben Walsh had led the final assault against the Purist Alliance flagship. His crew included humans, Vextar, Zephyrians, and members of 3 other species, all working together with the kind of seamless cooperation that military theorists had said was impossible. "This is what the future looks like," Ben had told his mixed-species crew as they approached the enemy ship. Not humans conquering the galaxy, but humans and aliens working together as equals. The victory had been decisive, but more importantly, it had proven that the changes humans had brought to galactic civilization were permanent. Alien species that had learned human values were not going to abandon them just because the war was over. Now, 6 months later, Frank was addressing a galactic council that bore little resemblance to the rigid, hierarchical organization that had first welcomed humanity. "We propose a new structure for galactic governance," Frank continued. "Not based on the dominance of powerful species over weaker ones, but on cooperation between equals who share common values." The old Galactic Council had been organized around ancient power structures that reflected who had conquered whom thousands of years ago. The strongest military empires held the most seats, while smaller or more peaceful species were relegated to observer status. Representative Larry Clark, humanity's chief political liaison, had worked with alien reformers to design a completely different system. "Every species gets 1 vote, regardless of military power or economic influence," he explained. "Decisions are made based on merit and consensus, not on who can threaten whom." The proposal was radical by galactic standards, but it reflected the new reality that human influence had created. Species that had once been considered weak or insignificant had become powerful allies when they learned human concepts of determination and mutual support. Military advisor Janet Pierce had seen this transformation firsthand while establishing the new joint training programs. "A thoughtful collective soldier trained in human tactics can outfight a Krex warrior using traditional methods," she reported. "Physical strength and advanced technology matter less than adaptability and teamwork." This principle was reshaping military doctrine throughout the galaxy. The new joint training facilities that Janet supervised were producing officers who could command mixed-species units with devastating effectiveness. Former enemies were learning to work together so well that their combined capabilities exceeded what either species could achieve alone. But the changes went far beyond military cooperation. Vextor Kodan, who had become the first alien to hold a senior position in the new Galactic Council, was overseeing scientific projects that would have been unthinkable under the old system. "We are preparing an expedition to the Galactic Core," he announced to the assembled delegates. "For the first time in galactic history, we believe we have the technology and the personnel to explore regions that have been considered impossibly dangerous." The Galactic Core was a region of space where gravitational anomalies, radiation storms, and spatial distortions made normal space travel impossible. Thousands of ships had been lost attempting to explore it over the centuries. Most species had simply written it off as unreachable. But human engineers working with alien scientists had developed new shielding technologies based on principles learned from studying Earth's extreme environments. More importantly, human psychology had taught other species that some challenges were worth the risk. "The expedition will be led by Captain Ben Walsh," Vextor Kodan continued. "His crew will include representatives from 12 different species, all trained in human survival techniques and adaptive problem-solving." The announcement generated excitement throughout the chamber. For most aliens, the idea of voluntarily entering the galactic core was terrifying. But they had learned from humans that fear could be overcome through preparation, determination, and mutual support. Ben Walsh himself was both honored and nervous about the mission. "We're not just exploring unknown space," he told his diverse crew during their final briefing. "We're proving that the galaxy has changed. We're showing that species working together can achieve things that none of us could do alone." The crew included humans like engineer Kelly Moore and navigator Matt Cooper, but also aliens who had adopted human values so completely that their own species sometimes didn't recognize them. Zephyrian scientist Crystal Song of Discovery had volunteered for the mission despite her people's traditional aversion to risk. "Humans have taught me that knowledge is worth pursuing regardless of danger," she explained. "If we find anything in the galactic core, it could benefit every species in the galaxy." Vextar warrior Kexalon had similarly abandoned his species' traditional caution. "My ancestors believed that survival was the highest virtue," he said. "But humans have shown me that some things are more important than survival." This philosophical transformation was perhaps the most significant change that human influence had brought to galactic civilization. For thousands of years, most alien species had been focused primarily on maintaining stability and avoiding risk. They had achieved great things through careful planning and conservative decision-making, but they had also become stagnant. Humans had introduced the radical idea that progress required taking chances. They had shown that failure was acceptable as long as you learned from it and tried again. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that cooperation based on shared values was more effective than domination based on superior force. The results were visible throughout the galaxy. Scientific research was advancing at unprecedented rates as species shared knowledge freely instead of hoarding it for competitive advantage. Military conflicts were being resolved through negotiation and compromise, rather than prolonged warfare. Even art and culture were flourishing as different species learned from each other's creative traditions. "We are witnessing the emergence of a truly galactic civilization," observed Dr. Kevin Torres, whose research into human influence had made him one of the galaxy's most respected xenosociologists. "For the first time, species from across the galaxy are working together toward common goals." But perhaps the most important change was less visible. Throughout the galaxy, young aliens were growing up with human concepts of individual worth, mutual respect, and personal responsibility. They were learning that their species' traditional limitations were not absolute, and that cooperation could overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. On New Terra, a human colony world that had become a model for integrated settlements, children from 8 different species played together in schools that taught universal values alongside species-specific traditions. They were learning to see differences as strengths rather than barriers. "My best friend is a thoughtful collective," explained 10-year-old human Sarah Martinez. "She thinks differently than I do, but that makes us a better team when we're working on projects." Her friend, Small Ripple on Still Water, had adopted human concepts of friendship that her elders found puzzling but beneficial. "Sarah has taught me that helping others makes me stronger, not weaker," the young alien explained. These children would grow up to be the leaders of a galaxy that bore little resemblance to the one their parents had known. They would take for granted ideas that previous generations had considered revolutionary, that cooperation was stronger than competition, that diversity. The testing began at dawn, Kepler station time. Jake found himself in a massive gymnasium alongside 46 other candidates, each representing their species' finest military potential. The air hummed with tension and barely contained aggression. Instructor, Cathara, a Zephyrian with silver markings across her blue skin, stood before them holding a data pad. "Physical assessment begins now. We will measure strength, speed, endurance, and reflexes. Your performances will determine your initial rankings." Jake watched as the first candidates stepped forward for strength testing. The Gorvani representative, who called himself Stone That Walks, approached what looked like a hydraulic press. He gripped the handles and began to squeeze. The machine's display climbed steadily. 500 pounds, 1,000, 1,500. The numbers kept rising until they reached an incredible 3,000 pounds of crushing force. Applause rippled through the watching candidates. Several Zephyrian observers made notes on their tablets, clearly impressed. "Impressive," Instructor Cathara announced. "Next!" The Krex warrior Zorthak stepped up next. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the gymnasium lights as he gripped the machine. His final score was 2,800 pounds, just below the Gorvani but still remarkable by any standard. When Jake's turn came, he could feel every eye in the room watching him. The machine felt cold under his hands as he gripped the handles and squeezed. The display climbed slowly. 200 pounds, 400, 600. Jake pushed harder, his muscles straining. 800 pounds, 900. At 1,000 pounds, his grip began to slip. Silence filled the gymnasium. Jake's score was respectable for a human, but pathetic compared to the other candidates. He heard quiet laughter from the Krex section and saw several Zephyrians shake their heads in disappointment. 1,000 pounds, Instructor Cathara announced, flatly. Next candidate. The speed trials were equally humbling. The Manthari representative, a insect-like being named Click Speaker, covered the 100-meter course in under 4 seconds, her 6 legs blurring with motion. The energy-based Lumari flowed across the distance in 3.8 seconds, shifting between solid and incorporeal states. Jake ran the course in 12.3 seconds, a respectable time for a human athlete, but embarrassingly slow compared to his competition. More laughter followed him back to the starting line. The endurance test involved running on treadmills until exhaustion. Here, Jake performed better, lasting 47 minutes before his legs gave out. But even this was overshadowed by the Nexari candidate, whose cybernetic enhancements allowed him to run for over 2 hours without tiring. By the end of the first day, the rankings were posted on a large display board. Jake found his name at position 43 out of 47 candidates. Only a few smaller species ranked below him. "The human is pathetic," Zorthak announced loudly during the evening meal. "I begin to doubt their species even deserves to be here." Other candidates nodded in agreement. A draconic representative hissed something that his translator rendered as, "Weak prey species should know their place." Jake sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating his meal while listening to the conversations around him. He noted who aligned with whom, who seemed threatened by whom, and who appeared confident versus who was hiding insecurity behind aggression. Dr. Lisa Chang found him there an hour later. As the only other human on the station, she served as both medical officer and unofficial liaison. "Rough first day?" she asked, sitting across from him. Jake shrugged. "About what I expected. They're all physically superior to humans in various ways. That's not news." Dr. Chang studied him carefully. "Your stress indicators are interesting. Heart rate, cortisol levels, neural activity, they're all elevated but not in the pattern I'd expect from someone who performed poorly." "What do you mean?" "Your body is responding like you're under extreme stress, but your performance suggests you weren't pushing your limits. It's almost like you were deliberately holding back." Jake met her eyes. "Maybe I was." "Why would you do that?" Jake finished his meal before answering. "Because this isn't really about the first week's scores. This program lasts 3 months. Right now, everyone thinks they know exactly what humans are capable of. They think they have us figured out." Dr. Chang leaned forward. "And that's useful." "To you how?" "Underestimation is a weapon, Doc. If they think I'm weak and stupid, they'll act accordingly. They'll make mistakes. They'll reveal things about themselves they wouldn't show to a real threat." The next few days followed a similar pattern. Combat simulations showed Jake losing to virtually every opponent in direct confrontation. Tactical exercises revealed him to be competent but unspectacular. Intelligence tests placed him in the middle ranks, well behind the enhanced Nexari and the naturally brilliant Zephyrians. The other candidates stopped paying attention to him. Conversations ceased when he approached. During group exercises, he was assigned to the least important roles. The instructors began ignoring him entirely, focusing their attention on the more promising specimens. But Jake was learning. He learned that the Krex culture valued individual honor above tactical advantage. He discovered that the Gorvani were nearly blind in certain light spectrums. He observed that the Lumari's energy forms were disrupted by specific electromagnetic frequencies. He noted that the draconic representatives were actually quite intelligent but had terrible impulse control when provoked. Most importantly, he learned about the Zephyrians themselves. They prized elegance and efficiency in combat. They respected strength but valued intelligence more. They saw themselves as the galaxy's natural leaders, benevolent shepherds guiding younger species toward civilization. On the 5th day, during a particularly brutal tactical simulation, Jake made his first real move. The exercise involved teams competing to capture a fortified position. Jake had been assigned to the weakest team, along with representatives from several smaller species that the others considered insignificant. While the stronger teams launched direct assaults on the fortress, Jake gathered his teammates for a different approach. He had noticed something during his careful observations. The fortress's shield generators were powered by geothermal vents that could be disrupted with precise strikes. We can't match their firepower, Jake explained to his team. But we don't need to. We just need to think differently. The Falari representative, a small aquatic being named Ripplesong, looked skeptical. The other teams have already begun their attacks. We will be too late. No, Jake said quietly. We'll be right on time. While the other teams exhausted themselves against the fortress's defenses, Jake led his group through a series of maintenance tunnels he had mapped during their initial reconnaissance. They emerged behind the shield generators just as the defending team's attention was fully focused on the main assault. The fortress fell in minutes once its shields dropped. Jake's team claimed victory while the stronger candidates stood outside, the walls battered and exhausted from their failed frontal assault. Instructor Cathara stared at the results display in apparent confusion. The tactical parameters indicate that Team 7 should have had only a 12% chance of success. Sometimes the math is wrong, Jake said simply. That evening, the conversation in the dining hall was different. Candidates who had ignored Jake for days suddenly found reasons to sit near him. Zorthak approached his table directly. "You fought cleverly today, human," the Krex warrior admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps there is more to your species than appearances suggest." Jake nodded politely. "We try our best." But he noticed something else in Zorthak's eyes. A flicker of wariness that hadn't been there before. The Krex was beginning to realize that his initial assessment might have been wrong. Dr. Chang found Jake in the observation deck later that night, staring out at the gas giant below. "Feeling better about today?" she asked. "Today was just the beginning," Jake replied. "They're starting to pay attention now. That's when the real test begins." "What do you mean?" Jake turned to face her. "They invited a human warrior to their program. They're about to find out what that really means." The rankings board updated at midnight. Jake had moved up to position 31. Not a dramatic jump, but enough to be noticed. Enough to start changing how the other candidates looked at him. In his quarters, Jake made another video call home. This time his father answered, wearing his old army uniform from his days as a drill sergeant. "How's the alien boot camp treating you, son?" "It's interesting, Dad. Different training philosophy than what we're used to." His father chuckled. "I bet they don't know what hit them. You were always good at playing the long game." After the call ended, Jake lay in his bunk thinking about what came next. The other candidates were still stronger, faster, and in many ways more capable than him. But they had one critical weakness. They had never faced anything like a human before. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, and new opportunities to show them exactly what a product of Earth's evolutionary pressure cooker could accomplish. When properly motivated, the galaxy was about to get its first real lesson in human warfare. The testing began at dawn, Kepler station time. Jake found himself in a massive gymnasium alongside 46 other candidates, each representing their species' finest military potential. The air hummed with tension and barely contained aggression. Instructor, Cathara, a Zephyrian with silver markings across her blue skin, stood before them holding a data pad. "Physical assessment begins now. We will measure strength, speed, endurance, and reflexes. Your performances will determine your initial rankings." Jake watched as the first candidates stepped forward for strength testing. The Gorvani representative, who called himself Stone That Walks, approached what looked like a hydraulic press. He gripped the handles and began to squeeze. The machine's display climbed steadily. 500 pounds, 1,000, 1,500. The numbers kept rising until they reached an incredible 3,000 pounds of crushing force. Applause rippled through the watching candidates. Several Zephyrian observers made notes on their tablets, clearly impressed. "Impressive," Instructor Kethara announced. "Next!" The Krex warrior Zorthak stepped up next. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the gymnasium lights as he gripped the machine. His final score was 2,800 pounds, just below the Gorvani, but still remarkable by any standard. When Jake's turn came, he could feel every eye in the room watching him. The machine felt cold under his hands as he gripped the handles and squeezed. The display climbed slowly. 200 pounds, 400, 600. Jake pushed harder, his muscles straining. 800 pounds, 900. At 1,000 pounds, his grip began to slip. Silence filled the gymnasium. Jake's score was respectable for a human, but pathetic compared to the other candidates. He heard quiet laughter from the Krex section and saw several Zephyrians shake their heads in disappointment. 1,000 pounds, Instructor Kethara announced, flatly. Next candidate. The speed trials were equally humbling. The Manthari representative, a insect-like being named Click Speaker, covered the 100-meter course in under 4 seconds, her 6 legs blurring with motion. The energy-based Lumari flowed across the distance in 3.8 seconds, shifting between solid and incorporeal states. Jake ran the course in 12.3 seconds, a respectable time for a human athlete, but embarrassingly slow compared to his competition. More laughter followed him back to the starting line. The endurance test involved running on treadmills until exhaustion. Here, Jake performed better, lasting 47 minutes before his legs gave out. But even this was overshadowed by the Nexari candidate, whose cybernetic enhancements allowed him to run for over 2 hours without tiring. By the end of the first day, the rankings were posted on a large display board. Jake found his name at position 43 out of 47 candidates. Only a few smaller species ranked below him. "The human is pathetic," Zorthak announced loudly during the evening meal. "I begin to doubt their species even deserves to be here." Other candidates nodded in agreement. A draconic representative hissed something that his translator rendered as, "Weak prey species should know their place." Jake sat alone at a corner table, methodically eating his meal while listening to the conversations around him. He noted who aligned with whom, who seemed threatened by whom, and who appeared confident versus who was hiding insecurity behind aggression. Dr. Lisa Chang found him there an hour later. As the only other human on the station, she served as both medical officer and unofficial liaison. "Rough first day?" she asked, sitting across from him. Jake shrugged. "About what I expected. They're all physically superior to humans in various ways. That's not news." Dr. Chang studied him carefully. "Your stress indicators are interesting. Heart rate, cortisol levels, neural activity, they're all elevated but not in the pattern I'd expect from someone who performed poorly." "What do you mean?" "Your body is responding like you're under extreme stress, but your performance suggests you weren't pushing your limits. It's almost like you were deliberately holding back." Jake met her eyes. "Maybe I was." "Why would you do that?" Jake finished his meal before answering. "Because this isn't really about the first week's scores. This program lasts 3 months. Right now, everyone thinks they know exactly what humans are capable of. They think they have us figured out." Dr. Chang leaned forward. "And that's useful." "To you how?" "Underestimation is a weapon, Doc. If they think I'm weak and stupid, they'll act accordingly. They'll make mistakes. They'll reveal things about themselves they wouldn't show to a real threat." The next few days followed a similar pattern. Combat simulations showed Jake losing to virtually every opponent in direct confrontation. Tactical exercises revealed him to be competent but unspectacular. Intelligence tests placed him in the middle ranks, well behind the enhanced Nexari and the naturally brilliant Zephyrians. The other candidates stopped paying attention to him. Conversations ceased when he approached. During group exercises, he was assigned to the least important roles. The instructors began ignoring him entirely, focusing their attention on the more promising specimens. But Jake was learning. He learned that the Krex culture valued individual honor above tactical advantage. He discovered that the Gorvani were nearly blind in certain light spectrums. He observed that the Lumari's energy forms were disrupted by specific electromagnetic frequencies. He noted that the draconic representatives were actually quite intelligent but had terrible impulse control when provoked. Most importantly, he learned about the Zephyrians themselves. They prized elegance and efficiency in combat. They respected strength but valued intelligence more. They saw themselves as the galaxy's natural leaders, benevolent shepherds guiding younger species toward civilization. On the 5th day, during a particularly brutal tactical simulation, Jake made his first real move. The exercise involved teams competing to capture a fortified position. Jake had been assigned to the weakest team, along with representatives from several smaller species that the others considered insignificant. While the stronger teams launched direct assaults on the fortress, Jake gathered his teammates for a different approach. He had noticed something during his careful observations. The fortress's shield generators were powered by geothermal vents that could be disrupted with precise strikes. "We can't match their firepower," Jake explained to his team. "But we don't need to. We just need to think differently." The Falari representative, a small aquatic being named Ripplesong, looked skeptical. "The other teams have already begun their attacks. We will be too late." "No," Jake said quietly. "We'll be right on time." While the other teams exhausted themselves against the fortress's defenses, Jake led his group through a series of maintenance tunnels he had mapped during their initial reconnaissance. They emerged behind the shield generators just as the defending team's attention was fully focused on the main assault. The fortress fell in minutes once its shields dropped. Jake's team claimed victory while the stronger candidates stood outside, the walls battered and exhausted from their failed frontal assault. Instructor Cathara stared at the results display in apparent confusion. "The tactical parameters indicate that Team 7 should have had only a 12% chance of success." "Sometimes the math is wrong," Jake said simply. That evening, the conversation in the dining hall was different. Candidates who had ignored Jake for days suddenly found reasons to sit near him. Zorthak approached his table directly. "You fought cleverly today, human," the Krex warrior admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps there is more to your species than appearances suggest." Jake nodded politely. "We try our best." But he noticed something else in Zorthak's eyes. A flicker of wariness that hadn't been there before. The Krex was beginning to realize that his initial assessment might have been wrong. Dr. Chang found Jake in the observation deck later that night, staring out at the gas giant below. "Feeling better about today?" she asked. "Today was just the beginning," Jake replied. "They're starting to pay attention now. That's when the real test begins." "What do you mean?" Jake turned to face her. "They invited a human warrior to their program. They're about to find out what that really means." The rankings board updated at midnight. Jake had moved up to position 31. Not a dramatic jump, but enough to be noticed. Enough to start changing how the other candidates looked at him. In his quarters, Jake made another video call home. This time his father answered, wearing his old army uniform from his days as a drill sergeant. "How's the alien boot camp treating you, son?" "It's interesting, Dad. Different training philosophy than what we're used to." His father chuckled. "I bet they don't know what hit them. You were always good at playing the long game." After the call ended, Jake lay in his bunk thinking about what came next. The other candidates were still stronger, faster, and in many ways more capable than him. But they had one critical weakness. They had never faced anything like a human before. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, and new opportunities to show them exactly what a product of Earth's evolutionary pressure cooker could accomplish. When properly motivated, the galaxy was about to get its first real lesson in human warfare. The transport ship dropped them at dawn on Zerion 7, a barren moon with an atmosphere just thick enough to breathe but hostile enough to kill the unwary. Jake stood with the other candidates on a rocky plateau looking out at a landscape that seemed designed by someone who hated life. Instructor Cathara held up a small survival pack. 7 days. Basic emergency rations for 2 days, water purification tablets, a knife, and a thermal blanket. Everything else you must find or make. Extraction point is marked on your maps, 50 kilometers from here. The candidates spread out, each examining their gear. Jake noticed that while the equipment was supposedly identical, some species had received modifications suited to their biology. The aquatic Falari had received different water tablets. The energy-based Lumari had some kind of power cell instead of food rations. Survive, reach the extraction point, and you pass, Cathara continued. This is an individual exercise. No cooperation is permitted. The moment the transport lifted off, the candidates scattered. The strongest beings immediately began racing toward the extraction point, confident in their ability to endure 7 days of hardship through pure physical resilience. Zorthak picked a direction and started walking, his chitinous armor protecting him from the sharp rocks and thorny vegetation. Stone that walks simply ignored the hostile environment entirely, his rock-like skin immune to most of what the moon could throw at him. Jake stayed put. While the others disappeared into the distance, he climbed to the highest point he could find and began a systematic survey of the area. The moon's twin suns cast harsh shadows that revealed geological features invisible from ground level. He spotted what looked like a dry riverbed, several cave systems, and areas where the vegetation was noticeably greener. Most importantly, he identified the weather patterns. Clouds were building along the horizon in a way that suggested this moon experienced regular storms. The atmospheric pressure was dropping, and the wind was shifting from the east. After 2 hours of observation, Jake finally began moving. But instead of heading directly toward the extraction point like the others, he moved perpendicular to that path, following the dry riverbed toward what he hoped was a more permanent water source. He found it 3 hours later, a natural spring, emerging from underground, creating a small oasis in the otherwise barren landscape. The water was clear and cold, and the vegetation around it included several plants that looked similar to Earth species he recognized as edible. Jake set up camp not at the spring itself, but half a kilometer away in a shallow cave that offered protection from wind and weather. He spent the rest of the first day carefully testing plants for toxicity, setting up water collection systems, and preparing for the storm he was certain was coming. The storm hit on the second night. Jake woke to the sound of wind howling across the moon's surface. Lightning split the sky, and rain fell in sheets that turned the rocky ground into a maze of flash floods and mudslides. From his cave, Jake could see the fury of the storm and feel grateful for his preparation. Other candidates were not so lucky. Theo. Next morning, Jake ventured out to assess the damage. The storm had been even worse than he had anticipated. Entire sections of the landscape had been reshaped by flash floods. Rocky overhangs that might have provided shelter had collapsed under the weight of accumulated water. As he explored, Jake found the first casualty. A Nexari candidate was trapped under a fallen boulder, his cybernetic leg crushed and sparking. He was conscious but clearly in severe pain. "Help!" the Nexari gasped when he saw Jake. "I cannot move." Jake studied the situation. The boulder was too heavy for him to lift alone, but the rock it rested on was unstable. If he could create the right leverage point. "This is going to hurt," Jake warned, then began systematically undermining the boulder's support points. 20 minutes later, the massive rock shifted just enough for the Nexari to drag himself free. "Why did you help me?" the cyborg asked as Jake fashioned a splint for his damaged leg. "The exercise forbids cooperation." "They said no cooperation was permitted," Jake replied, tearing strips from his thermal blanket to bind the splint. "They didn't say anything about basic medical aid." The Nexari stared at him. "You are splitting semantic hairs." "I'm choosing to interpret the rules in a way that lets me sleep at night," Jake said. "There's a difference." As the days passed, Jake encountered more struggling candidates. Ripplesong, the small Falari, was suffering from dehydration after her water purification tablets proved insufficient for the moon's mineral-heavy springs. Jake showed her how to build a solar still that could produce clean water from almost any source. A draconic candidate named Flame Tongue was slowly starving, his high metabolism body burning through his rations too quickly. Jake shared what he had learned about which local plants were safe to eat. By the 5th day, word had spread among the remaining candidates. The human wasn't competing in the traditional sense. He was surviving, and helping others survive too. Some saw this as weakness, but others began to see it differently. Jake reached the extraction point on the 6th day, ahead of schedule but far from first. He found several candidates already there, including Zorthak and Stone That Walks, both looking haggard but intact. "Human!" Zorthak called out when he saw Jake approaching. "I am surprised to see you here." "Why?" Jake asked, setting down his pack and beginning to set up a shelter. "The storm was fierce. Your soft skin offers little protection." Jake nodded. "That's true. So I made sure I wasn't exposed to it." Over the next day, more candidates straggled, and many bore signs of harsh treatment from the moon's environment. Some had visible injuries. A few looked like they had barely survived at all. But several candidates arrived in surprisingly good condition, carrying stories of unexpected help from the human who had shown them how to find water, identify safe food, or construct better shelters. The Nexari Jake had rescued limped in on the final day, supported by a makeshift crutch Jake had helped him fashion. When instructor Keth Ara asked how he had survived with such severe injuries, he pointed directly at Jake. "The human saved my life," he said simply. That evening, as they waited for pickup, Jake found himself surrounded by candidates who wanted to understand what he had done. Their questions revealed something interesting about their respective species' approaches to survival. Most had relied on their natural advantages. The Gorvani endured through toughness. The Kreks fought through with determination. The enhanced species used their technological advantages, but none of them had really adapted to the environment. They had simply tried to overpower it or outlast it. Your species thinks differently about survival, observed Clickspeaker, the Manthari representative. You do not simply endure hardship, you study it and find ways to make it work for you. We had to, Jake replied. Our world didn't give us thick armor or energy manipulation or cybernetic enhancements. We had to get creative. Ripplesong, who had been quiet since her rescue, finally spoke up. On my world, we have a saying, the strong swimmer fights the current. The wise swimmer uses it. I think humans are wise swimmers. When the transport arrived to collect them, 39 candidates remained. 8 had been evacuated early due to injuries or equipment failures. Of those who completed the exercise, Jake was the only one who had helped others survive. Commander Vex High was waiting when they returned to Kepler Station. He reviewed the reports in silence, his luminous eyes unreadable. Finally, he addressed the group. Survival training is designed to test not just your physical capabilities, but your decision-making under stress and your ability to adapt to unfamiliar environments, he announced. Some of you excelled at endurance, others demonstrated excellent preparation and planning. His gaze found Jake in the group. One candidate chose to interpret the exercise in an unexpected way. Rather than focusing solely on individual survival, he appeared to prioritize species survival. Murmurs ran through the assembled candidates. Jake wasn't sure if this was criticism or praise. This approach is interesting, Commander Vexahai continued. It suggests a fundamentally different evolutionary perspective. We will discuss this in detail during tomorrow's debriefing sessions. That night, Jake video called home again. His mother answered this time, her face lighting up when she saw him. You look thin, she said immediately. Are they feeding you enough? The food's fine, Mom. Just been doing some camping. How are you getting along with the other children? Jake smiled at her choice of words. Better than expected. Turns out, some of them needed help with their camping skills. After the call, Jake lay in his bunk thinking about what Commander Vexhai had said. The Zephyrian seemed genuinely puzzled by Jake's behavior during the survival exercise. To Jake, helping injured comrades was simply the right thing to do. But apparently, that wasn't how most galactic species approached such situations. Dr. Lisa Chang visited him later that evening. The medical reports from the survival exercise are fascinating, she said. You had multiple opportunities to gain significant advantages by leaving injured competitors behind. Instead, you consistently chose to help them. And none of the other species understand why. They're trying to figure out if it was a complex tactical decision or evidence of some kind of psychological weakness. The psychological evaluation chamber was a sterile white room with no visible equipment, just a single chair in the center. Jake sat motionless while invisible scanners mapped his brain activity, stress responses, and neural patterns. Around him, holographic projections began to flicker to life. The first scenario was simple: a recreation of his childhood home, perfect in every detail. Jake watched his younger self playing in the backyard while his parents worked in the garden. The scene was peaceful, nostalgic, designed to establish baseline emotional responses. Then, the house caught fire. Jake watched calmly as flames consumed his memories, as holographic versions of his family screamed for help. His heart rate increased, slightly, but the monitors showed none of the panic response the Zephyrian psychologists expected. Instead, his brain patterns indicated analytical thinking. He was studying the fire's progression, calculating escape routes, assessing which family members could be saved, and in what order. The scenario shifted. Now he was in a military situation, watching his squad members die around him. Each death was rendered in horrific detail, designed to trigger trauma responses. The other candidates had broken down during these tests. The proud Krex warrior had actually wept. The cybernetically enhanced Nexari had shown stress patterns that nearly overloaded their monitoring equipment. Jake's response was different. He mourned each death, but part of his mind remained detached, professional. He noted tactical errors that had led to casualties. He calculated how the situation could have been handled differently. Even while experiencing simulated trauma, he was learning from it. Dr. Zeftai, the station's chief psychologist, studied the readouts with growing fascination. "Remarkable," she murmured to her assistant. "His emotional responses are normal, even healthy. But there's a cognitive partition. Part of his mind simply refuses to be overwhelmed. The scenarios became more extreme. Jake was shown the destruction of Earth, the enslavement of humanity, the torture of loved ones. Each test was designed to find his breaking point, the moment when emotion would override rational thought. That moment never came. Subject maintains tactical awareness even under extreme psychological stress, Dr. Zeftai noted. This suggests an evolutionary adaptation to persistent trauma environments. The final test was the most disturbing. Jake found himself in a scenario where he was forced to choose which of his fellow candidates would live or die. The situation was impossible, designed to create paralyzing moral conflict. Instead, Jake began testing the parameters of the simulation. He pushed against the boundaries of the scenario, looking for options the test designers hadn't considered. When forced to make the terrible choice, he selected himself as the casualty, then immediately began working on ways to invalidate his own decision. When the tests ended, Jake sat in the chair for several minutes, allowing his heart rate to return to normal. The psychological evaluation had been exhausting, but not in the way the designers intended. He was tired from constantly analyzing and adapting, not from emotional trauma. Instructor Cathara entered the chamber, her expression unreadable. "How do you feel, Candidate Murphy?" "Fine," Jake replied honestly. "Ready for the next test." "Were any of the scenarios disturbing to you?" Jake considered this carefully. "Yes, they were all disturbing. That was the point, wasn't it? Yet you showed remarkable emotional stability throughout." "I've learned to compartmentalize," Jake said simply. "Bad things happen. When they do, you deal with them. Falling apart doesn't help anyone." Later that day, Jake participated in group therapy sessions designed to process the psychological testing. The other candidates were clearly shaken by their experiences. Several had required sedation after their individual sessions. Flame Tongue, the draconic representative, was barely coherent. "The images, the sounds. How does one forget such things?" "You don't forget them," Jake said quietly. "You file them away and learn from them." Zorthak stared at him. "How can you speak so calmly about such horror?" "Because horror is part of reality," Jake replied. "My species has been dealing with reality for a very long time." Dr. Zeftai watched these interactions with intense interest. The human was naturally assuming a counselor role, helping other candidates process their trauma while showing no signs of needing such help himself. "Tell me about your world," she said, addressing Jake directly. Jake looked around the circle of candidates, all watching him expectantly. "Earth is beautiful," he began, "but it's also trying to kill everything on it all the time. The weather can freeze you or burn you. The animals will eat you if you're not careful. Diseases, natural disasters, toxic plants. Everything on our world is some kind of threat. How did your species survive such conditions? Asked Ripplesong. We adapted. We learned to think our way around problems instead of just powering through them. And we learned to work together because none of us was strong enough to survive alone. Clickspeaker tilted her insectoid head. This explains your behavior during survival training. You instinctively formed cooperative bonds even when told not to. Helping others help themselves is just efficient, Jake said. A stronger group has better survival odds than a strong individual. The next phase of psychological testing involved scenario-based decision-making. Candidates were presented with tactical situations requiring immediate choices. Most species showed predictable patterns. The Krex chose honor over pragmatism. The Gorvani chose endurance over speed. The enhanced species relied on their technological advantages. Jake's patterns were harder to categorize. His decisions seemed to follow a complex calculus that balanced immediate tactical needs against long-term strategic goals, individual safety against group survival, and moral considerations against practical necessities. In one scenario, he was commanding a unit tasked with holding a bridge against superior forces. Traditional military doctrine would suggest either retreating or making a heroic last stand. Jake chose a third option. He destroyed the bridge while his forces were still on it, denying the enemy their objective while using the destroyed bridge's debris to create a defensible position downstream. Unconventional, commented the Zephyrian, tactical instructor. But effective. In another scenario, Jake was presented with a prisoner who might have vital intelligence. Most candidates either chose to interrogate aggressively or to follow strict ethical guidelines. Jake chose to make the prisoner comfortable, provide medical aid, and then spend hours in casual conversation, gradually building rapport until the information was volunteered freely. Time-consuming, noted another instructor. But psychologically sound. Dr. Zeftai compiled her reports with growing concern. The human's psychological profile was unlike anything in their databases. He showed remarkable resilience to trauma, adaptive thinking under pressure, and an unusual ability to find cooperative solutions to competitive problems. But there was something else, something that disturbed her professional instincts. Jake's responses suggested that humans had evolved not just to survive trauma, but to weaponize it. He didn't just endure psychological pressure, he learned from it, cataloged it, and prepared to use similar techniques against others if necessary. His mind is like a weapon that sharpens itself, she confided to Commander Vexhide during their private briefing. Every test we put him through makes him more capable of handling similar situations in the future. Commander Vexhide studied the psychological profiles of all candidates. And the others? They show normal responses to the testing. Stress, trauma, recovery. The human shows stress, adaptation, and improvement. It's as if his species evolved in an environment where psychological warfare was a constant factor. That's an interesting theory, the commander mused. What does it suggest about their military potential? Dr. Zeftai hesitated before answering. That we may have seriously underestimated them. Physical weakness can be compensated for with technology, but psychological adaptability of this degree, that's much more dangerous. That evening, Jake found himself approached by several candidates who had been struggling with the psychological tests. They wanted to understand how he remained so calm under pressure. My people have a saying, Jake told them. The best steel is forged in the hottest fire. Bad experiences don't have to break you. They can make you stronger instead. But how? Asked the Nexari, who Jake had helped during survival training. How does one transform pain into strength? Jake thought about his drill instructor days, about the young Marines he had trained who came from broken homes, abusive families, and failed schools. You take the lesson without keeping the hurt, he said finally. Learn what the experience teaches you, then leave the rest behind. As the psychological testing phase concluded, Jake noticed that the other candidates' attitudes toward him had shifted again. The initial dismissal had turned to wariness after the survival exercise. Now, after seeing how he handled psychological pressure, that wariness was becoming something approaching fear. They were beginning to understand that the soft, weak human might be the most dangerous being in the program, not because he was physically threatening, but because he was psychologically unbreakable in ways they couldn't comprehend. Dr. Lisa Chang found Jake in the observation lounge later that night, staring out at the gas giant below. The combat training arena was a massive dome filled with adjustable terrain, environmental controls, and enough sensor equipment to track every movement, every heartbeat, every tactical decision. 47 candidates stood in formation as weapons. Master Dractel explained the rules. Combat trials will test your ability to engage opponents using strategy, skill, and whatever natural or technological advantages your species possesses, the scarred Zephyrian announced. Weapons are provided, but you may use any tactic you deem necessary to achieve victory. Jake examined the weapon racks with interest. Energy weapons, projectile firearms, bladed implements, and various exotic devices designed for non-human physiology. Most candidates immediately gravitated toward weapons that complemented their natural abilities. Zorthak selected a massive two-handed blade that would have been impossible for most species to wield effectively. Stone That Walks chose a warhammer that looked like it could crack mountains. The enhanced Nexari picked up energy weapons with targeting systems that interfaced directly with his cybernetic implants. Jake chose a simple combat knife and a sidearm that fired non-lethal training rounds. Interesting choices, observed weapons. Master Dractel, light armament for someone from a gravity world. I prefer to stay mobile, Jake replied. The first round of combat trials was structured as individual duels. Candidates faced off in pairs, with winners advancing and losers receiving additional training. Jake's first opponent was a Manthari, warrior named Sharpblade, whose 6 limbs and natural chitinous armor made her a formidable close combat fighter. The arena configured itself into an urban environment, complete with buildings, alleyways, and multiple levels. Sharpblade immediately leaped to the rooftops, using her superior mobility to gain the high ground advantage. Jake didn't try to follow her. Instead, he disappeared into the building labyrinth below. For several minutes, nothing happened. Sharpblade prowled the rooftops, searching for her opponent. The spectating candidates grew restless, wondering if the human was simply hiding. Then Sharpblade's comm system crackled to life with Jake's voice. I know about your breeding cycles. Sharpblade froze. What did you say? Your species' biological records are in the station database, Jake continued, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Right now, you're in the aggressive phase. High hormone levels, increased territorial instincts, reduced ability to think strategically. It makes you dangerous in direct combat, but predictable. Sharpblade snarled and leaped between buildings, trying to trace the signal. Face me directly, coward. Why would I do that? You're faster than me, stronger than me, and better armed. Fighting you on your terms would be stupid. Jake's psychological analysis was exactly correct. Sharpblade's current biological state made her aggressive but impulsive. She abandoned tactical thinking and began tearing through the arena, destroying cover and making noise as she hunted for her opponent. Jake waited until she was completely enraged, then appeared briefly at ground level. Sharpblade spotted him and launched herself from a third-story window, claws extended for a killing strike. Jake wasn't there when she landed. He had rolled aside at the last second, and Sharpblade's momentum carried her into a carefully positioned trap. The training ammunition from Jake's sidearm wasn't powerful enough to penetrate her natural armor, but it didn't need to be. He had aimed for the joints where her exoskeleton was weakest. Sharpblade found herself immobilized, training rounds lodged in the gaps of her armor in precisely the right locations to restrict movement. Jake appeared beside her, knife at her throat. "Yield?" he asked politely. The arena fell silent. Jake had defeated a superior opponent without using any advantages his species naturally possessed. Instead, he had used intelligence gathering, psychological manipulation, and tactical planning to turn her own strengths against her. "Most interesting," Weapons Master Draktel announced. "Victory to the human." Jake's next opponent was a draconic warrior named Iron Scales. Dragons were proud, powerful, and supremely confident in their natural combat abilities. Iron Scales approached the duel as a matter of honor, expecting a brief but glorious battle. The arena reconfigured into an open plain with scattered rocky outcroppings. Perfect terrain for a dragon's natural fighting style. Open sky for flight, room to maneuver, clear sight lines for their devastating breath weapons. Iron Scales took to the air immediately, circling high above, while Jake took cover behind the rocks. The dragon's advantage was overwhelming. Flight, ranged attacks, armored hide, and superior physical strength. "Come out and face me properly!" Iron Scales roared, unleashing a blast of superheated plasma that turned sand to glass. Jake's response came from his comm system. "Tell me about your military history." "What?" "Your species' military tradition. It's all about individual combat, isn't it? Single warriors proving their worth in direct confrontation. Very honorable." Iron Scales circled lower, confused by this conversational gambit. "Of course. What else would combat be?" "My species learned a different lesson," Jake continued. "We learned that honor doesn't stop bullets. Pride doesn't protect against coordinated attacks. And the most dangerous enemy is the one who refuses to fight fair." As Iron Scales swooped down for another attack run, Jake's trap revealed itself. The rocky outcroppings weren't natural formations. They were positions he had prepared during his initial survey. As the dragon passed overhead, Jake triggered a series of concealed charges that filled the air with reflective particles. Iron Scales' next plasma blast reflected off the metallic cloud, creating a brilliant but harmless light show. Temporarily, blinded and disoriented, the dragon crashed into the arena floor. Jake emerged from cover, not to attack, but to help. He offered Iron Scales a hand up, medical attention for minor injuries, and even tactical advice about how to counter similar strategies in the future. "Why do you help me after defeating me?" Iron Scales asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because we're not really enemies," Jake replied. "This is training. The goal is for everyone to become better warriors, not to humiliate opponents." This behavior confused the spectators even more than Jake's tactical innovations. Galactic military tradition typically involved clear winners and losers, dominance and submission. Jake seemed to operate by entirely different rules. His third opponent was Stone That Walks, the massive Gorvani, whose rock-like hide had proven impervious to most conventional weapons. The arena configured into a maze of narrow passages and confined, spaces where the Gorvani's size would be both advantage and disadvantage. Stone That Walks approached the confrontation with typical Gorvani philosophy: steady, methodical, unstoppable. He began systematically smashing through walls, creating straight-line paths toward where he thought Jake was hiding. Jake led him. For 20 minutes, the Gorvani demolished the maze while Jake stayed just out of reach, never engaging directly. The spectators grew restless again, but Jake was executing a specific strategy. Gorvani were virtually indestructible, but they had one weakness. Their massive bodies required enormous amounts of energy to function. Stone That Walks was burning through his reserves with every wall he destroyed, every charge he made. When the Gorvani finally cornered Jake in what appeared to be a dead-end chamber, both fighters were exactly where Jake wanted them to be. Stone That Walks raised his massive fists for the killing blow. Jake dropped a ceiling on him. The chamber had been undermined during the maze's construction, and Jake had spent his time in the arena carefully weakening the support structures. Stone That Walks' own impacts had done the rest. The Gorvani found himself buried under several tons of rubble, uninjured but completely immobilized. "I could dig you out," Jake offered through the debris. "Or you could yield and we can have the arena reset you." Stone That Walks considered this for a long moment. "Your species fights without honor." "My species fights to win," Jake corrected. "Honor is a luxury for those who don't have to worry about survival." By the end of the first day of combat trials, Jake had defeated 7 opponents using 7 completely different strategies. He had used psychological warfare against the Manthari, technological disruption against the Draconic, environmental, manipulation against the Gorvani, and various other approaches tailored to each opponent's specific weaknesses. But more disturbing to the observers was how he gathered his intelligence. Between matches, Jake moved among the other candidates like a social coordinator, asking innocent questions about their cultures, their biology, their military traditions, information that he then weaponized in subsequent fights. "He is learning about us," Zorthak observed to a group of candidates that evening. "Every conversation is reconnaissance. Every interaction is intelligence gathering. Is that necessarily bad?" asked Ripplesong. "Knowledge is power. Should we not respect his dedication to understanding his opponents?" "It depends on his intentions," replied the Nexari Jake had helped during survival training. "Is he learning about us to fight us more effectively, or to understand us better as potential allies?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Commander Vex High watched the combat recordings with growing unease. Each of Jake's victories had been achieved through methods that no other species had ever employed in their combat trials. The human. The accident happened during what should have been a routine training exercise. Candidates were practicing non-lethal combat techniques, working in pairs to demonstrate restraint and control. Jake was paired with Ripplesong, the small Falari. He had helped during survival training, practicing defensive maneuvers against larger opponents. Across the training mat, Zorthak was working with Softwing, a delicate insectoid from a low-gravity world. The Krex warrior was supposed to be demonstrating how to subdue an opponent without causing harm. Instead, Zorthak grabbed Softwing by both arms and twisted violently. The sound of breaking chitin echoed across the training hall. Softwing's scream was a high, keening noise that made every being in the room freeze. The insectoid collapsed, his arms bent at unnatural angles, green fluid pooling beneath his shattered exoskeleton. "Medical emergency!" shouted Instructor Cathara, rushing toward the injured candidate. Zorthak stood over his victim, showing no concern. The creature was too weak. This was inevitable. Jake was across the training mat in seconds, dropping to his knees beside Softwing. The insectoid was going into shock, his respiratory system failing as pain overwhelmed his nervous system. "Get a medical team now," Jake ordered, applying pressure to the worst wounds while positioning Softwing to keep his airways clear. "He's bleeding internally." Dr. Lisa Chang arrived with the medical team moments later. As they worked to stabilize Softwing, Jake stood and turned to face Zorthak. "Why?" Jake asked quietly. The Krex warrior shrugged. "I was demonstrating a restraint technique. If the insect could not handle basic combat maneuvers, he had no business in this program." "That wasn't a restraint technique. That was deliberate injury." Zorthak's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. "Perhaps humans are too soft to understand proper discipline. On my world, weakness is corrected through pain." Something changed in Jake's expression. The helpful, friendly demeanor that had characterized his behavior for weeks simply vanished, replaced by something else entirely. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Colder. "I see," Jake said. "And how exactly does your world handle those who deliberately harm the defenseless?" "The strong do as they will. The weak endure what they must." Jake nodded slowly. "Interesting. Philosophy." The medical team managed to stabilize Softwing and transport him to the medical bay. Dr. Chang reported that he would survive, but his arms were so severely damaged that he would never regain full function. His military career was over. That evening, Jake approached Instructor Cathara with a formal request. "I want to invoke the right of challenge," he said. Cathara stared at him. "Against whom?" "Zorthak. Personal combat. Full weapons, no restrictions." The Zephyrian instructor's eyes widened. The right of challenge was an ancient galactic tradition, rarely invoked, that allowed individuals to settle disputes through formal combat. It was legal, but it was also potentially lethal. "Candidate Murphy, this is not necessary. Zorthak will face disciplinary action for his behavior today." "What kind of disciplinary action?" Cathara hesitated. "Additional training, possibly a formal reprimand." "That's not sufficient." "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish?" Jake's expression remained calm, but something in his eyes made Cathara take an involuntary step backward. "I'm going to teach him what happens when you prey on those weaker than yourself." Word of the challenge spread through the station within hours. Formal combat challenges were rare events, and this one had unusual circumstances. A human challenging a Krex warrior was already unprecedented. But the cold fury in Jake's demeanor had caught everyone's attention. Commander Vex High tried to intervene personally. "Candidate Murphy, I understand your anger, but this escalation is unnecessary. Zorthak's actions were inappropriate, but they do not warrant—" "With respect, Commander," Jake interrupted. "They warrant exactly what I'm going to give them. You cannot possibly hope to defeat a Krex warrior in direct combat. They are bred for individual fighting. Their natural armor, their strength, their combat training—" "Yes, sir. I've studied their capabilities extensively." Something in Jake's tone made Commander Vex High pause. "To what end?" "To learn how to kill them efficiently." The challenge was scheduled for the next evening in the main arena. Galactic combat law required both participants to choose weapons from approved lists, with medical teams standing by and formal observers present. Zorthak selected traditional Krex weapons, a ceremonial blade nearly as long as Jake was tall, and armor that enhanced his already formidable natural defenses. He approached the arena with the confident swagger of a warrior who had never lost a formal challenge. Jake chose the same simple knife and sidearm he had used throughout the combat trials. "You mock this sacred tradition," Zorthak declared as they faced each other in the arena center. "Fighting a Krex warrior with such pathetic weapons is an insult to both our species." "I'm not mocking anything," Jake replied. "I'm using tools appropriate for the job." "And what job is that?" "Pest control." The arena fell silent. Even Zorthak seemed stunned by the casual viciousness of the insult. Then his mandibles spread in rage, and he raised his massive blade. "I will enjoy teaching you about Krex superiority soft skin." Jake's response was too quiet for most spectators to hear, but the arena's audio systems picked it up and broadcast it throughout the station. "You're about to learn why humans are the only species that hunts for sport." The fight began with Zorthak's traditional Krex charge, a devastating assault designed to overwhelm opponents through pure aggression and power. His blade whistled through the air in killing arcs, any one of which would have ended the fight instantly. Jake wasn't there to receive them. Instead of trying to block or parry attacks from a weapon he couldn't possibly match, Jake simply wasn't where Zorthak expected him to be. He moved with economy and precision, staying just outside the Krex warrior's reach, while his opponent exhausted himself with increasingly frustrated attacks. "Stand still and fight," Zorthak roared. "Why would I do that?" Jake replied, circling, just outside striking distance. "You're bigger, stronger, better armed and better armored. Fighting you on your terms would be stupid." It was the same tactical approach Jake had used throughout the combat trials, but this time it felt different. There was no hint of mercy or restraint in his movements. Every dodge, every feint, every repositioning maneuver was calculated to maximize Zorthak's frustration and energy expenditure. For 10 minutes, Zorthak chased Jake around the arena, his massive blade cutting empty air while Jake maintained perfect distance. The Krex warrior's breathing became labored, his movements less precise. That's when Jake began his real attack. It started with words. As Zorthak swung his blade in another futile assault, Jake's voice carried clearly across the arena. "You're fighting. Style is exactly what I expected from your psychological profile. Aggressive, straightforward, predictable. You're not a warrior, you're just a bully with better weapons." Zorthak's next attack was wilder, less controlled. "Your species calls this honorable combat," Jake continued, still dancing just outside range. "But there's nothing honorable about what you did to Softwing. You hurt someone weaker than yourself because you could. That's not strength. That's pathetic." The Krex warrior was breathing heavily now, his natural armor becoming a liability, as it trapped heat from his exertions. His attacks were slowing, becoming more telegraphed. "You know what the really sad part is?" Jake said, beginning to move closer instead of maintaining distance. "You actually believe you're superior. You think being born with natural weapons and armor makes you better than everyone else. But you've never had to fight anything that could really hurt you back." Zorthak lunged forward in desperation, overextending himself. Jake stepped inside the reach of the massive blade and struck for the first time. Not with his knife, with his words. "Until now." The combat knife found the gap in Zorthak's armor just below his jaw, sliding between chitin plates with surgical precision. Jake's sidearm pressed against the Krex warrior's abdomen, aimed upward at an angle that would penetrate his primary heart. Zorthak froze, suddenly understanding that he was one trigger pull away from death. "Yield," Jake said quietly. I cannot. Krex warriors do not yield," Jake repeated, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Or I will end you right here." For the first time in his life, Zorthak experienced genuine fear. He looked into Jake's eyes and saw something that made his blood freeze. This human wasn't bluffing, he wasn't posturing, he was simply stating a fact. Surrender or die. "I yield," Zorthak whispered. Jake held the position for 3 more seconds, making sure every being in the arena understood exactly what had just happened. Then he stepped back and lowered his weapons. "Medical team to candidate Zorthak." He called out calmly. "Minor lacerations. Possible shock." The arena was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Jake walked over to where Commander Vexhai sat with the other observers. "Is the challenge satisfied?" he asked formally. Commander Vexhai nodded slowly. "The challenge is satisfied." "Good." Jake's demeanor shifted back to the friendly, helpful personality the other candidates were used to. "I should check on Softwing, see how he's recovering." As Jake left the arena, conversations erupted throughout the spectator. The emergency session was called at 600 hours, station time. Commander Vexhai sat at the head of a conference table, surrounded by his senior staff, department heads, and representatives from several galactic military academies who had been observing the exchange program. The topic of discussion was a single human Marine from Ohio. "Status report," Commander Vexhai requested. Dr. Zeftai consulted her datapad. "Candidate Zorthak remains in medical isolation. Physical injuries are minor, but psychological trauma is severe. He shows symptoms consistent with complete dominance displacement syndrome. In simple terms, his warrior identity has been shattered." "And the other candidates?" Instructor Kethara spoke up. "Morale is complicated. Many are genuinely afraid of the human now. Others seem to view him as a potential ally worth cultivating. None of them are dismissing humans as weak anymore." "What about Murphy himself?" "That's the disturbing part," Dr. Zeftai continued. "His psychological readings show no signs of remorse, guilt, or trauma from the confrontation. He appears to view the entire incident as a solved problem. He's back to his normal helpful behavior with other candidates." Commander Vexhai leaned back in his chair. "Recommendations?" The table fell silent. Finally, Weapons Master Draktel spoke. "Sir, I've been training galactic military personnel for 40 years. I've seen every species approach to warfare. What that human did yesterday wasn't just combat. It was systematic psychological destruction. He didn't defeat Zorthak. He broke him. Your point? My point is that we may have seriously underestimated what we're dealing with. I recommend we request detailed briefings from the human delegation about their species' military capabilities and cultural background." An hour later, Dr. Lisa Chang found herself standing before the assembled Zephyrian command staff. She had expected this moment since Jake's challenge, but she wasn't sure they were ready for the truth. "Dr. Chang," Commander Vexhai began, "we need to understand what we witnessed yesterday. Candidate Murphy's behavior patterns suggest military doctrines and psychological approaches unlike anything in our experience. What specifically would you like to know? Start with your world. What kind of environment produces warriors like Murphy?" Dr. Chang activated a holographic display showing Earth from space. "This is our planet. At first glance, it appears similar to many inhabited worlds. Standard gravity, breathable atmosphere, abundant water. The image zoomed in to show various landscapes, jungles, deserts, mountains, oceans, but Earth is what we call a death world. Nearly everything on it is actively trying to kill everything else. She displayed images of Earth's predators: lions, sharks, crocodiles, venomous snakes, disease-carrying insects. These are just the obvious threats. Our world also features extreme weather, natural disasters, toxic plants, bacterial diseases, and environmental hazards that would be considered weapons of war on most civilized planets. The Zephyrian staff exchanged glances. General Techmore, the station's strategic advisor, leaned forward. How did intelligent life evolve under such conditions? By becoming the most dangerous thing on the planet, Dr. Chang replied simply. Humans aren't the strongest species on Earth, or the fastest, or the best armed naturally, but we became the most effective killers through intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. She changed the display to show human hunting techniques: persistence hunting, tool use, coordinated pack tactics. Early humans developed what we call persistence hunting. We would chase prey animals for days until they collapsed from exhaustion. We learned to make weapons, to plan complex strategies, and to work together to bring down creatures much larger and stronger than ourselves. This explains the tactical innovation, mused Weapons Master Dractel. But what about the psychological aspects? Dr. Chang's expression grew more serious. That comes from the other part of human evolution. We didn't just have to survive the natural world, we had to survive each other. The display changed to show human historical conflicts, ancient battles, medieval warfare, modern military operations. Human civilization has been shaped by constant warfare. For thousands of years, we've been fighting increasingly sophisticated conflicts against opponents who think exactly like us. This created evolutionary pressure for psychological adaptability, strategic thinking, and the ability to understand and exploit enemy psychology. She paused, letting this sink in. Most galactic species evolved past their violent phases before developing advanced technology. Humans never did. We've spent our entire history perfecting the art of war. Commander Vexhai studied the historical images. These conflicts, they appear to be total warfare. Entire populations involved. Yes, human warfare evolved concepts that most species never developed. Total war, psychological operations, strategic deception, mutually assured destruction. We learned to fight wars not just with weapons, but with economics, information, and psychological pressure. Dr. Zeftai looked disturbed. This suggests that Murphy's behavior yesterday was not aberrant for your species. Correct. Jake is actually quite restrained by human standards. He neutralized a threat, demonstrated consequences for harmful behavior, and then returned to cooperative behavior. That's textbook conflict resolution for someone with his training. His training? General Techmore asked. Jake Murphy is what we call a Marine. Marines are trained specifically for expeditionary warfare in hostile environments against unknown enemies. Their job is to go into dangerous situations, adapt quickly, and achieve objectives through whatever means necessary. The room was quiet for 3 weeks later. The Galactic Military Exchange Program concluded with a formal ceremony in Kepler Station's Grand Assembly Hall. Representatives from 47 species gathered to witness the graduation of candidates who had survived the most rigorous military training program in known space. Jake Murphy stood with the other graduates, wearing a simple dress uniform that looked plain compared to the elaborate ceremonial gear worn by representatives of other species. but everyone in the hall was watching him. Commander Vexhai approached the podium with a data pad containing his final assessments. The traditional ceremony involved ranking candidates by overall performance and offering positions in various galactic military organizations. "Candidates," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "You have completed a program that tests the finest military minds and warriors our galaxy has to produce. Each of you has demonstrated capabilities that honor your species and advance our understanding of galactic military potential." He paused, looking directly at Jake. "This year's program has been particularly enlightening. We have witnessed tactical innovation, psychological resilience, and strategic thinking that has forced us to reconsider our assumptions about warfare and military capability." Murmurs rippled through the assembled candidates and observers. The top graduate of this year's program demonstrated performance that exceeded our measurement parameters in several categories. His approach to problem-solving, adaptation under pressure, and force multiplication through cooperation has been unprecedented. Jake felt every eye in the room focusing on him. Candidate Jake Murphy of Earth stepped forward. Jake walked to the center of the assembly hall, aware that his every movement was being analyzed by representatives of species that now viewed humans as either valuable allies or dangerous enemies. "Candidate Murphy," Commander Vexhai announced, "you have achieved the highest overall rating in the 200-year history of this program. Your tactical innovations have been incorporated into our training manuals. Your psychological insights have revolutionized our understanding of asymmetric warfare." He held up a crystalline device that gleamed with inner light. "By authority of the Zephyrian High Command and the Galactic Defense Council, you are hereby offered the rank of Strategic Advisor with full access to classified military intelligence and authorization to train senior officers from any species in advanced combat doctrine." The hall fell silent. The position being offered was typically reserved for the most senior military minds in galactic civilization. Offering it to a 22-year-old human was unprecedented. Jake accepted the device with appropriate ceremony, but his response surprised everyone. "I'm honored by this offer, Commander. But I request permission to return to Earth to consult with my superiors before accepting any position in galactic military structure." Commander Vexhai nodded. "Of course. Take whatever time you need," but Jake wasn't finished. "I would also like to recommend that future exchange programs include multiple human participants. What you've seen from me is just one perspective on human military capability. There are others who could contribute different insights." A chill ran through the assembled observers. The idea of multiple humans with Jake's capabilities operating in galactic military circles was both exciting and terrifying. The ceremony continued, with other candidates receiving their assignments and recognitions. But the focus remained on the quiet human who had fundamentally changed how the galaxy viewed warfare. Later that evening, Jake found himself in the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars and thinking about home. Other candidates approached him throughout the night, some to offer congratulations, others to simply understand what had happened over the past 3 months. Ripple Song was among the first to speak with him privately. "You saved my life during survival training," she said quietly. "Not just from dehydration, but from despair. I want to thank you." "You don't need to thank me for that," Jake replied. "We were all in the same situation." "No, we weren't. You had advantages you could have pressed, skills you could have used to eliminate competition. Instead, you chose to help others succeed." Jake considered this. Helping others succeed made everyone stronger. That benefits everyone in the long run. Even your enemies? Jake turned to look at her. I don't have enemies here. I have potential. Allies and potential threats. It's an important distinction. Click Speaker approached next, her insectoid features showing what passed for curiosity among her species. Your methods of combat were unlike anything in our databases, she said. Where did you learn such techniques? Basic training, mostly, and experience. Basic training taught you psychological warfare? Jake smiled. Basic training taught me to think creatively about problems and to use every available resource to accomplish the mission. The psychology part is just pattern recognition and cultural analysis. You make it sound simple. The concepts are simple. The application takes practice. Even Stone That Walks made an effort to speak with Jake before departure. I underestimated your species, the massive Gorvani admitted. I judged you by physical appearance and ignored capabilities that cannot be measured in strength tests. That's a common mistake, Jake said diplomatically. Humans make it too. We often focus on obvious threats while missing subtle ones. What would you advise to avoid such errors in the future? Jake thought carefully before answering. Study behavior patterns rather than physical capabilities. Watch how someone responds to stress, how they treat others when they think no one is looking, how they solve problems they've never seen before. That tells you more about their real capabilities than any test score. Stone That Walks nodded slowly. Wisdom, I will remember this. Zorthak was notably absent from these conversations. The Krex warrior had withdrawn from most social interactions since his psychological defeat, spending his time in meditation and what his species called honor reconstruction. He would return to his home world carrying a very different understanding of strength and weakness. Dr. Lisa Chang found Jake late that night, still standing at the observation deck windows. Tomorrow you go home, she said. Yes, looking forward to it. Are you ready for what comes next? Jake looked at her questioningly. Jake, what you've accomplished here is going to change everything. Earth is about to become a major player in galactic politics. They're going to want you to train others, to develop human military doctrine for galactic application. That's not necessarily a bad thing. No, but it's a big responsibility. You've shown the galaxy what one human can do. Now they want to know what humanity as a whole is capable of. Jake nodded slowly. And that scares them. Yes, it should scare you, too. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Dr. Chang, do you think I did the right thing here? Which part? All of it. The way I approached the training, the psychological manipulation, what I did to Zorthak. Dr. Chang considered her answer carefully. I think you did what you thought was necessary to protect others and complete your mission. That's very human of you. Is that good or bad? It's both. That's what makes humans so dangerous and so valuable as allies. The next morning, Jake boarded a transport ship for the journey back to Earth. His departure was witnessed by nearly every candidate and instructor from the program. Word had spread throughout the station about the human who had graduated at the top of his class while revolutionizing galactic military thinking. Captain Ryan Torres, who had served as Jake's handler throughout the program, accompanied him on the journey home. So, Torres said as Earth grew larger in their view screen, how does it feel to be the most famous Marine in the galaxy? Jake smiled. I'm not famous. I'm just the guy who went to alien summer camp. Jake, you realize that every species in the galaxy is now re-evaluating their military doctrines based on what you demonstrated, right? Good. Maybe that means fewer incidents like what happened to Softwing. Torres studied Jake's expression. Do you really see it that simply? What do you mean? The galaxy is afraid of us now. They're offering us partnership positions and defense contracts because they want to make sure we're on their side. That's not respect. That's fear. Jake considered this. Fear and respect aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes fear is how respect begins.